Sometimes things are terrifying all around outside. Wildfires, hurricanes, pandemic, genocide. Is this the apocalypse? Will it be the end? How can we all save ourselves if we can't all be friends?
1, 2, 3.
So come on in to a place that is fun. I'll be your friend and you can be mine. The world is a stream of constant bullshit, but that doesn't mean there's not a whole lot of good shit. You start with believe and we can make something different. Let's build a world that is good. This is a show for adults. Hi, welcome to the good world. Good to have you here, friends. This is a pomelo. We have a pomelo tree in our yard that is, this one's pretty gross and probably not edible on the inside. It looks pretty eaten by, I don't know, bugs or something. So this one is about half the size of the largest ones. They get pretty big. Pomelos are my understanding, and please correct me if you're a person who knows more about this than I do, because I don't. My understanding is that they are sort of an ancestral grapefruit. Like grapefruits were sort of, pomelos evolved first, and then they were sort of cultivated into grapefruits. So they're bigger, they're a little sweeter. They also have, I'm not going to open this one, it's a little gross, but they have a very, very thick pith. The skin, you know, the actual, well, the white part inside the skin, inside the peel. But it tastes pretty good. Yeah, it's all, will this work? That's not going to work. Anyway, yeah, we have a tree in this house, a pomelo tree. A thing that's really lovely about Sacramento is there are fruit trees, especially citrus trees, all over the place. So we have some friends here who had a citrus juicing party recently, and that was a lot of fun. But our pomelo tree it's like 60, 65 years old, something like that. And again, this is pretty big. Imagine something twice this size. And the top of the tree is probably about 30 feet high. And so if you're walking under the tree, it's actually kind of a big hazard, because if these fall, it could maybe give you a concussion. I don't know. We haven't found out. We have done our best to avoid finding out. But that pomelo is just going to sit over there by the window. This window, not that window. You can only see this window. There's another window here. Maybe someday I'll show you around in here, but it's going to need to be cleaned up more first, because part of the ADHD brain is that things go places and then they stay there. Actually, a thing that has come up a lot in my marriage with Susie, and something I've been working on, is sometimes I will stop seeing a thing. It will just sort of, in my brain, cease to exist because it has been in a place for an amount of time. And so I am working on that. I am working on remembering that things are there, because if I put something in the middle of the room and then I stop seeing it, it just sits in the middle of the room, and that's not ideal for anybody. No one really wants that. But anyway, shed's a little messy, but it's not. It's okay. It's a work in progress, just like me, and I'm guessing just like you. Anyway, welcome back. So I made an executive decision, because it's my show, it's my channel. I can do that. I'm just going to put my phone /timer over there instead of having it in my pocket. I made a decision to expand the time. So the last time there were the bells that signaled to me when to take a break. That's still going to happen, but now we're up to half an hour total instead of 20 minutes total, because I don't know, because I have a lot to say, and maybe you like listening to it because you're here. So I'm going to assume that if you're here, you want to be here. And if someone is pressuring you to watch me, I don't know why they would do that, but I guess call 911 or 999 if you're in the UK. Or you can just stick around because hopefully you'll enjoy it. So, at the end of the most recent episode, I was sort of starting to talk about randomness and spirituality and also racism. Kind of got into there, and so I've been thinking about that across the last couple days and sort of how to pick up where I left off. I'm not always going to pick up where I left off, but I feel like I left that unfinished, and I did in fact specifically call it a cliffhanger, so I may as well return to me on the cliff of racism in America. So when I talk about randomness, so randomness is a tricky thing to explain. I think it is something that when we hear the word random, I know that when I was in high school, my friends and I would always be like, "Oh, that's so random. Oh, random." It was a word we used a lot. I think that still happens a fair amount, but it was very, very much a thing that my friends and I said in high school. And what we meant in that context was unexpected, right? Random means something totally out of left field, and that was our interpretation of the word. But in the world of math and computers, random just means there is some kind of defined numerical distribution, and that's a tricky thing to explain. We'll start with a simple one. There is something called a uniform distribution, and the uniform distribution is bound by whatever limits you set. And so a very common one is a uniform distribution bound by 0 and 1. And literally that just means a random number from the uniform distribution between 0 and 1 literally means any number, and there are an infinite number of them, right? You could have 0.027659664 whatever. A random number between 0 and 1 is literally, it can be anything. It doesn't mean something way out of left field. It just means anything that fits that defined distribution between 0 and 1. Also, humans are interestingly really, really bad at generating true randomness. We will try to generate balance. So if I ask you to generate a sequence of random numbers between 1 and 10, let's say, and you write down, you can even do this. Write down on a piece of paper, I don't know, if you really want to get into it, write down 100 different digits. Just go, let's say 0 through 9, so you don't have to do the second digit involved in the number 10. So if you were to write down 100 digits in a row, just trying to be random, they would actually not be random. You would tend to produce something that is more balanced than actual randomness. Because actual randomness, something we don't think about a lot, is actual randomness has a lot more repetition than we expect, right? If you generate 100 random numbers in a row, you as a human being will probably not have a lot of situations where you have the same number 3 times in a row. You probably won't say, 1, 4, 6, 7, 2, 2, 2, or you certainly won't go 1, 4, 6, 7, 2, 2, 2, 2. But actual randomness, if you put the numbers 0 through 9 into a basket, and you pull one out and you write down what it is, and you put it back and you pull one out and write down what it is, and do that again and again. If you actually generate it randomly, there will be a lot more of those sequences of 4 in a row, 5 in a row. Anyway, digression, kind of. But randomness is, we are not actually great at thinking about randomness. It's taken me some time to really sort of grasp the way that it works. But, so when I say that something is indistinguishable from randomness, this is a lot of, if you've heard of hypothesis testing, p-values in statistics, you've maybe come across it. When people talk about things being statistically significant, what they actually mean is you're actually asking, what are the odds that the pattern that we see was generated totally randomly? Because we can't actually say this is definitely a true thing. But we can say, well, if it were generated randomly, it probably wouldn't look like this. And we can actually, that's where the math comes in. You can quantify how likely or unlikely something is to have been generated by randomness. And at the end of the day, the question is, does this seem like it is definitely not randomness, or is it actually indistinguishable from randomness? And indistinguishable from randomness doesn't mean that it is definitely random. It just means we can't tell. So as an example, in baseball for a long time, people thought that catchers had no real impact on the results of the pitchers, and that was based on some simulations that found that the results, if you were to assume that catchers had a big impact, the results would look different at the aggregate level than they are when generated by randomness. Or I should say, what happened when people ran these studies is that the results were indistinguishable from catchers being random and not actually having any particular innate ability to be good at things that help their pitchers. Over time, we've gotten better data. We now know that catchers contribute a lot to the calls of balls and strikes. Anyway, if you're a baseball fan, that story is helpful. If you're not, that means nothing, so I apologize, so we're going to move on. But the question that I ask all the time when I'm looking at pretty much anything is this actually indistinguishable from randomness? And so here's the thing where sort of my approach to spirituality and philosophy comes in, and where if you haven't thought about this a lot, if you really sort of dig into this, it might blow your mind. It might not. I might be overstating my own impact if I say it might blow your mind. But anyway, most of the hierarchies in our society are indistinguishable from randomness. I'm going to say that again, and I think some people may be feeling defensive, may be feeling, some people might feel hurt or upset or outraged or just thinking that can't be true. In a long enough view, the hierarchies in our society are indistinguishable from randomness. Let me say what I mean by that. First off, let's assume for a moment something that I don't think is actually true, that where everyone ends up in our society, relatively speaking, is the result of their genetics. 100% result of their genetics. I don't think that's true, but let's assume for the moment that it is. Genetics are driven by randomness. Genetics are, you take my mom's DNA, you take my dad's DNA, you sort of throw them in a shaker, and part of my dad's DNA comes out, part of my mom's DNA comes out, they meet up together, and they form me, and which specific pieces come from each of them are random. They are like a dice roll. They are like putting the digits 0 through 9 into a little jar and shaking it and just picking one. So if, in fact, all of our society is determined by genetics, again, I don't think that, but if we assume that that's true, well, that still means that it's all driven by randomness, because genetics is driven by randomness. So let's start there. Now let's sort of go to the other end of things, and let's think about environmental factors. You know, people are always saying nature versus nurture. Well, we don't know. Is it nature or is it nurture? And by the way, the answer is it's both. The answer with most things is it's both. It's both nature and nurture. Those things interact a lot. There's a lot of research about it. We can come back to that. But if we're talking just about the nurture element of it, genetics is the nature, we can assume. So Susie and I had the fortune and privilege to travel a bunch. Well, we've traveled a fair amount. That comes from, I've talked before about my privileged white beard face, and this is part of it. And so a few years ago, we both quit our jobs. We spent 4 months, not 4 years, traveling. Charlie was sad when we left, but he was very happy to stay with our friends. He loves them. And in our travels, two of the places we went to a bunch of places, but two places we went were Vietnam and France. Those were two of the places that we spent, in fact, the most time. We spent about a month in each of those two countries. We spent less time in other places. So about half of our trip was in one of Vietnam or France, and then half of the trip was in other places. And it was really interesting because, first off, Vietnam was colonized by France for a pretty long time. We in America tend to think that the Vietnamese must hate us because of what we call the Vietnam War. They call it the American War. But that was such a short amount of time to them compared to the amount of time that they were occupied by French colonial forces, and before that, for much longer, by Chinese colonial forces. So actually, it's not that they necessarily love certainly the American military, but by and large, the source of Vietnamese trauma, America is a contributor, but there's a lot more background to that than we tend to think about when we think about it from our own perspective. But so Vietnam, colonized by France. Um, so Susie and I, as part of our travels, had we were able to go to sort of to parts of the country other than things we had heard of before, frankly. So in Vietnam, we went to the Central Highlands and we went on a trek. It was a really cool trek. We went to, I think it's the second or third largest, maybe it's the largest cave in the world by volume. Huge cave, very very large cave. And it was amazing. We sort of trekked down a mountainside and then just walked along this winding river valley, and you could see on either side of the river all of these different hills and sort of I don't know, karsts I think is technically the term, but these sort of single monolithic looking hills of granite. Oh boy, oh, that went earlier than it was supposed to. No, that went on time. Okay. We're gonna take a break. I'm gonna pick up here. We're gonna take a break. It's gonna be fine. It's we're figuring things out together, right? Okay. We'll be back in a moment. Please like and subscribe. 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 Hi, welcome back. Okay, so picking up where we left off, Vietnam, karsts. Crazy geological formations, these huge sort of granite towers, and there were caves that were running through them that were carved by the very river that we were walking along, and we crossed the river a bunch of times. It was a really beautiful place. It is also the case that on the hills to either side of us, the jungle was really, really dense. During my knowledge from watching the Ken Burns documentary about the Vietnam War, which is pretty much the full extent of my knowledge on that subject. The American military referred to it as triple canopy jungle. I don't entirely know what that means, but presumably it means there's sort of 3 layers of trees, right? Very, very dense jungle. And because of the climate, because of the humidity, the jungle grows really thick there and is sort of constantly covering things over. The river that we walked along, the cave that we went to, is also subject to massive seasonal floods. So we went in February? Yeah, February. Almost exactly however many years ago it was. That was 2019. Almost exactly 3 years ago. And there are... I think the seasonal rains are in the fall, but I apologize. I actually don't remember the specifics. But for a stretch of the year, you can't do the trek because the river gets really, really high and the cave is blocked off. You can't get to it because there's too much water. And that is sort of part of the nature of the climate of this part of Vietnam, is just they're just huge amounts of water that just come through for a month or two every year, which makes it impossible to stay there during that time, right? Also, I don't know. I think there are still tigers there. There are probably not as many as there used to be. There probably used to be a lot more. Anyway, that's Vietnam. We also, or that's this one specific part of my experience in Vietnam. We also went to a place in sort of south central France, where there are these incredible 20,000, 30,000-year-old cave paintings. So we went and we got to see in person a 30,000-year-old cave painting. Something in a cave 30,000 years ago, there was a human being sitting there with like some burnt stuff, just drawing a horse on the wall. And one of them, the horse in particular, was actually, someone drew the outline, and then 1,000 years later, someone else came along and found it and was like, ooh, I'm going to give it a mane. And then someone else 2,000 years later was like, I'm going to put some handprints on the horse. So it's this crazy thing where there's this 30,000-year-old and also slightly newer, but still tens of thousands of years old, graffiti on the wall. It was a really incredible experience. If you ever get the opportunity, I strongly recommend it. But it was fascinating to look at the sort of topographical similarity between where we were in France and where we were in Vietnam, because it was the same kind of thing where there was a river winding through, and these caves were made of the same material. Both of them were millions of years ago. They were part of the seafloor, and then everything kind of lifted up, and there were these huge rocks, and And over time, water, because water does an amazing job of carving away at Earth, water carved, carved valleys and carved caves and all of these things. So very similar forces of nature at work in creating the rivers and the caves that we saw in France and the rivers and the caves that we saw in Vietnam. An important difference is that France is more temperate. It gets cold in the winter, but sort of manageably cold. And it gets hot in the summer, but sort of manageably hot. You don't have the really extreme heat that you have in Vietnam. You don't have those 2 months of insane seasonal flooding, making it impossible to be there. And you have vegetation that grows and thrives and is very happy, but is sort of pretty easy to manage. And so if you just think of these two different places, one of them is a really, really good place to settle permanently, and one of them is impossible to settle permanently. You still have to kind of come and go. You can go seasonally, but you can't be there full time all through the year. And so the reason that I'm sharing this, coming back to randomness and things being indistinguishable from randomness, if you think back to our human ancestors tens, hundreds of thousands of years ago in Africa, and sort of starting to migrate out away from Africa, the decision of where to go was effectively random because people just didn't know what they would find, right? If you especially if you're going east versus west, you can imagine that going north versus south, you can figure out some differences based on the sun, but who ended up going to what is now France versus who ended up going to what is now Vietnam was effectively random. There was no underlying force driving it other than these people happen to go this way, these other people happen to go that way. But the people who ended up in France ended up in this place that was a really, really good environment to live in and to thrive in. No tigers. There were lions at some point, but it's been a while since there have been any real major predatory threats, and also people had a lot to do with that, and killed those animals. But you can sort of see how ending up in these two different places. So you end up in Vietnam. You are having to navigate in order to survive all of this crazy jungle. Things are growing all over the place. There are tigers. There are seasonal rains that make it impossible to stay where you are, and you have to kind of be more mobile, and you have to do a little more mental and emotional work just to survive on a day-to-day basis. Whereas you go to France, and it's, we're still talking tens of thousands of years ago, so things weren't as easy as they might be now. But comparatively, you can start to cultivate all kinds of things in the soil, and you don't have to worry about moving around. And obviously, I realize that Vietnam is a very geographically and topographically diverse country, far more diverse than we tend to think of in America. It's a very big country. It is about as long north to south as the east coast of the US. And so we think of it as like, oh, Vietnam, that is one thing. Vietnam is a lot of things, and I'm not going to be able to encompass all of them. But so I'm comparing this one specific part of Vietnam to this one specific part of France. But one of those places was easier for humans to thrive in than the other. And you can sort of look at all of the world and see how those differences kind of keep showing up. And over time, the people who have an easier environment are able to give more time to things like developing technology. And because we're still talking about humans, and we're talking about humans tens of thousands of years ago, people are still tribal now. They were very tribal then. And so part of the technology you're going to develop is maybe related to being good at murdering other people. And so, you develop swords and cannons. And except of course cannons rely on gunpowder, which Europeans learned about from China. So, China, I have not been to China. I know a lot less about China. I only know a little about Vietnam. But point being, the more you can thrive wherever you are, the easier it is to start to focus on things other than just your basic survival. And over time, oh, excuse me, that's my air conditioner. And over time, you end up with a situation where Europeans have all of this technology for murder, and then they go to, say, Africa or the Americas, and people have been living differently, and they're surviving very well, and they're very happy, but murder is not as big a part of it, and gunpowder is certainly not as big a part of it. And so they just kind of show up, and they're better at murder, and so they win in the conflicts. And then you find yourself there, and you're a European person in the Americas, and you're like, oh, well, I won, so I must be better. I must be the superior race. And so when we think about racism, a lot of it can come from the fact that if you go way back, all of the circumstances that led to people's different statuses today are indistinguishable from randomness, yet we find ourselves in this position where where we are born into being the conqueror or the conquered, or maybe, during our lives we sort of take our advantage and continue conquering, but we still started with the advantage. I personally started with a significant advantage over many other people, and it is very common, based on our human brains and our insecurity, frankly, and our egos, to sit there and think, well, I deserve this. Right? I could look at this nice house that Susie and I live in with our pomelo tree, and most of the pomelos aren't weird and gross like this one, and I could think, well, I am amazing. I brought this about with my education and with my work, and so therefore I am great, and I deserve it, and other people don't deserve it. And in fact, if you really look at the heart of it, it's just a bunch of dice rolls on top of dice rolls on top of dice rolls on top of coin flips on top of dice rolls. And yet here I am, and we can either accept that maybe we are not some superhuman special, Ubermensch, or we can recognize that actually all of us could be any of us. I can look at you, whoever you are, where you are, and realize that the only thing that put me in my life and you in your life is just a dice roll. And something I've been thinking about a bunch recently, so again, I've traveled a lot, right? Which comes from all of this privilege that I have to have been born into, not just the white beard face, but also the money. And again, thanks Dad, who, lawyer in New York, it's a lucrative way to make a living. And no judgment. Again, thank you. It enables this. And that's complicated, and there's all kinds of complicated stuff when it comes to thinking about wealth and accumulation and all of that. But, so I've traveled to a lot of places. I'm going to grab my whiteboard over here, and I'm going to just try to draw you a little chart based on places I have gone. So I've met people, I've met like people in fishing villages in Southeast Asia, and I've met literal billionaires. And I have worked with people who, by the sort of standard American definition of success, are extremely successful. And so we hear stories about how they must be really smart, they must work really hard, all of these things. And I will tell you that in my experience, most of the people who have the most money in America are able to do that because either they are good at lying in ways that are not quite illegal, or they are good at stealing in ways that are not quite illegal. Very often they are taking credit for other people's work, but because they are putting themselves front and center, they get to take the credit. Sometimes they are, that is not the case for my dad, but that is a lot of his clients. And that's sort of a lot of what happens if you work in the world of big law. One of my closest friends, I have several friends who work in that world, frankly, but one of them said to me recently, yeah, we had a really good year last year. We made a lot of extremely rich people slightly richer. And so making extremely rich people slightly richer is a good way to make yourself pretty richer, it turns out. But that doesn't mean that any of the people involved in this are smarter or more hardworking. And so here, I'm going to draw a little graph. So if this line is how wealthy someone is, money. And this is, I don't really think that there is such a thing as one catch-all metric for what makes a good person. So we're just going to call this how much I enjoy spending time with them, and how much I find them to be pleasant to engage with or utterly insufferable. And so these down here is someone who, by American standards, would be considered incredibly poor. Susie and I befriended some folks when we were in Indonesia who are sort of fine by Indonesian standards, but they talked about dreaming of coming to America, and the idea of buying a plane ticket from Indonesia to America is not a thing that's within the realm of reality for them. which I realize applies to a lot of people in America who are working class. That's a whole different conversation. I'm not trying to dismiss the challenges that anyone faces. Anyway, so let's put sort of varying levels of I don't even necessarily want to say poverty, but let's say lack of wealth over here. And, this is extreme wealth. And this is how much I enjoy hanging out with them. That's a heart. Yeah, you can see it. Okay. Lights reflecting. Now you know that there are lights in here. My secret's out. Okay. So this is how much I enjoy people. This is their wealth. And I would say that, generally speaking, these things, each dot is a person. And this is flat. I'm trying to make it flat. Just to be clear. But then once you get up here, it just goes down a bit. It doesn't go like all the way to zero. But, and the truth is, in reality, these dots are like all the way over the place. But the people who end up here, we treat as heroes, and they must be brilliant. They must have done so much to earn everything they have. They must have worked so hard. And I've met a lot of people, and I've worked with a lot of people who are in this area, and I've met and worked a lot of people all along here. And the biggest thing that I have learned throughout all of that experience, whether it was growing up, whether it was in college, whether it's been traveling around, whether it's been working as an adult, that sound means that it's time for me to wrap up, which is fine, because I'm wrapping up. The people who end up here are not better than anyone else along this line. And they are slightly more insufferable on average, in my experience. On average, of course, doesn't mean everyone, but on average means on average. An average is an average. There's a whole other episode I want to do at some point about averages and how our brains tend to sort of overestimate the meaning of the average. There's a social psych term I'm not remembering, but we sort of tend to think of the average in place of engaging with the individual. And like the average, at least when I was growing up, the average American home had 2.3 children. No household has exactly 2.3 children because that's murder, I guess. I don't know. Let's ask King Solomon, who was like, "Hey, kill a baby." I think it's John Mulaney has a whole bit about that, and so I'm not going to sort of venture down the road of accidentally possibly stealing that. I'm going to be very clear to give credit, in fact. Anyway, so this is sort of aggregate level the point that I want to make, right, is that so much of this is driven by randomness. Who you are, what body you're born into is driven by randomness. Where you end up in the world with a long enough view is driven by randomness. And there is so much that goes into shaping our reality that is just driven purely by randomness, that to give some kind of emotional attachment to the idea that I deserve a thing, you don't deserve a thing, I'm better than you, is insecure nonsense. Sorry if that's harsh, but it's true, in my opinion. It really, like, we don't need to make everyone's reality about ourselves. Everyone who you have ever met has merit, and if you feel like they really don't, probably there's some stuff in their life that you don't know about. That's also part of my experience. That's probably several episodes worth of conversations. But we don't need to go down that road right now. Right now, we can just end here. I am going to, I decided that I should have a closing song. So now, in addition to the opening song, we get a closing song. And probably I'm going to mess it up because this is the first time I'm doing it and I don't have it all the way in my brain yet. So if I do, I haven't decided. Depends how bad I mess it up, but there may be a cut here, and then you may see me performing it flawlessly, or I may just sort of muddle my way through. Anyway. Well, thank you, friend, for your visit today. Now it's time we both go on our way. The world will still be insane tomorrow, but don't let that fill your heart with sorrow. You can thrive in a desert, just ask a saguaro. please give to my Patreon. Capitalism is fun. Let's build a world that is good. This is a show for adults.